أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In this session, we are going to talk about mediation analysis with multiple mediators in IBM SPSS AMOS. Now, what if we have multiple mediators? In the last session, we assessed how to evaluate the indirect effect of IV on DV through a single mediator. Now, there may be a situation when you have more than one mediator. So how will you carry out the analysis in SPSS AMOS with multiple mediators? As stated earlier, when you request an indirect effect in AMOS, this will give you all the possible indirect effects in your model. You may have a single mediator or multiple mediators in the model. What AMOS will give you is that it will give you the indirect effect for all the possible mediators. If you have a single mediator, this function is quite handy. But if you have multiple possible mediators in a model, this function can be problematic because what we need is separate specific indirect effects, not the total indirect effect from IV to DV through the multiple mediators. The reason for this problem is AMOS will assess the indirect effect from an independent to dependent variable through all possible mediators. It will not separate the effects for each mediator. This has to be done manually. The program will try to examine the total indirect effect through all possible mediators. This type of analysis is not that helpful because mediation really needs to be assessed with each individual mediator instead of the collective group. To find the indirect effect between two variables where there are numerous possible mediators, we have to use different method from how we assessed mediation in the previous example where there was only single mediator. To examine individual relationship in a multiple mediator model, AMOS has a function called Estimands that will actually allow you greater flexibility in the analysis of complex model. The Estimands function is syntax based, that is, you will have to write some sort of code, but that is very easy to write. There are no icons or drop-down menu we can use to accomplish our task of examining a specific indirect effect when we have multiple mediators in a model. We will have to use this Estimands function. Thus, we are going to use syntax-based Estimands function to examine a specific indirect effect within a larger model. Now, let's assume this is our model that we want to examine. Now, we've got one IV, organizational learning, that is abbreviated as OL, collaborative culture as CC, organizational commitment as OC, and organizational performance as OP. Now, there is one IV, one DV, and two mediators. Now, how do you run this model in AMOS? Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to have proper analysis properties. To determine if the indirect effect of OL to OP is significant, that is through these mediators, we need to request from AMOS the indirect, direct, and total effects in the output. This will give all the possible indirect effects in the model. How to do this in AMOS? Open your AMOS, and here are your analysis properties. Click on it, go to your output tab, and I have got this selected already. In your case, if it's not selected, just select it. Now, before we close it, let's look at the other slide. Bootstrap properties, because we are going to use bootstrap procedure to assess our indirect effect, that is the mediating role of the variables. Next, we need to request a bootstrap analysis in AMOS. To do this, we have to go to Bootstrap tab. This is your output. The next is Bootstrap. In this case, I will select Perform Bootstrap and I will keep it to 200 for the sake of this video. Bias corrected confidence interval, by default this is 90. I'm going to keep it to 95. Now moving on. Analysis procedure. So when you have multiple mediators, AMOS will require you to denote what specific relationship you are concerned with testing for the indirect effect. To do this, you will have to label all the indirect parameters for the specific relationship you are concerned within the model. Now, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by labeling? Now, if we look here in this model, what we are doing is we are assessing these relationships from OL to CC, CC to OP, OL to OC, OC to OP. Now, another one is this. Now, we need to label all these indirect relationships here. Now, how do we label these indirect effects? So, in this example, I will label the path as A1 from OL to CC, B1 from CC to OP, A2 from OL to OC, and B2 from OC to OP. So these are the paths and these are the labels that I'm going to assign to these paths. Now, how do we do this in AMOS? Now, I've already done this, but now in order to do this, you will come here and this is obviously highlighted as red. So you double click on it and this is your path A1. Just type in A1, go to parameters and type in A1. Now this is another path B1. So double click on it and this will go to parameters and this is B1. Look at this here. This is A2. So you double click on arrow, go to parameters and type in A2. Similarly, you will do this for this path here from organizational commitment to organizational performance. Just go in here, double click on it, go to parameters and write your regression weight or label it as B2. Now all your paths are labeled A1, B1, A2, B2. Now this is your independent variable with all these indicators. These are your mediators with these indicators and this is your dependent variable. Now look at the endogenous variables here. Organizational commitment is your endogenous variable being affected by organizational learning. Similarly CC and similarly OP. Now look at this here, an error term. Where do you get the error term? You get the error term from here. Just select it and click here and it will be edit. In order to name this, you can automatically name this by going to plugins and name unobserved variables. Moving on. Once the regression weights are labeled, the next step is to define the estimand for calculating individual specific indirect effects. Now, once we have labeled all the model like this, the next step is we have to add user-defined estimand to calculate our indirect effects. Now, how do we calculate the indirect effect? So the indirect effect from OL to OP through OC is actually the multiplication of A1 and B1. The indirect effect of OL on OP through organizational commitment is actually the multiplication of A2 and B2. So how do you define the estimand? In order to define the estimand, click Not Estimating Any User-Defined Estimand at the bottom of your window. Now what you do is, at the bottom of the window on the left hand side, you click on this Not Estimating Any User-Defined Estimand and define New Estimand. In this case, this is the equation that we are going to build. How to do this? Let's go back to AMOS. Now, estimating multiple mediators estimate. I've already done this. So what you can do is, you will see that there in your case, it will be not estimating any user-defined estimate. So what you'll do is you'll go here, defined new estimate. And here you will define your new estimate. In this case, I'm going to define it A1, B1 is equal to. Now this is the indirect effect of OL on OP through CC. So A1, B1. So how do you get the indirect effect? What you do is you multiply A1 with B1. Similarly, do it for the other mediating or indirect effect, A2, B2, which is the indirect effect of organizational learning on organizational performance through organizational commitment is equal to A2 multiplied by B2. Now what you do is simply save it. Where do you want to save it? Just name it. Let's say this is it. Now this is saved. You can close it. So it's estimating multiple mediators estimate. So there is an estimate now. Once you have defined the estimate, the next step is to run your analysis. First run the analysis and then we are going to discuss these steps on how to analyze the results. In this case, what you can do is just click calculate estimates, and then you can go to the output view text here. Now here are our results. Now this is something that we are interested in, estimates. Now this will give you the direct effects from each of the variable, like from organizational learning to collaborative culture. Organizational learning is your IV, collaborative culture is your DV, just by clicking estimates. So what are the steps in analyzing a model with mediators? Before we do that, just have a look at the estimates. This is the direct effects from each of the relationship is shown here. Now look at this, A1, this is path A1, path A2, B1, B2. Are these paths significant? Well, yes, apart from this one. CC to OP is not significant. Now this is your scalars, and look at this, user defined estimates. So your indirect effect from your organizational learning to organizational performance through collaborative culture is this. The indirect effect from organizational learning to organizational performance through organizational commitment is this. But is it significant? How would I know? So you select here and then you go to bias corrected confidence interval here, bias corrected percentile method. Now how do you interpret this? Let's go back. Just make sure you know that in order to get to this estimates bootstrap, make sure you select these options. Only then these options are active. If you select any other options from the top, these are inactive. These are only active when you select the respective options from matrices or scalars here within the estimates. Like user defined estimates, I want to find out the significance of it. So I will come here. Now look at this. This is active. Now similarly, you can go to indirect effects and look at the two-tailed significant. This is the total indirect effect of IV on DV through both the mediators. So the total indirect effect is significant. However, what about the individual indirect effect? In order to get that, you will have to have user defined estimates. Now how do you interpret all this? Now what are the steps that one has to understand in order to analyze, interpret and report these results? So I'm going to stepwise look into all these results. Let's look at step 1. Let's look at the output to determine if the mediation is present. So once you go and click on view text, you need to go to estimates. Here, this is your estimates. And from the estimates, you will have to select matrices. Now from matrices, select indirect effects, and this window here will become active. Now once this become active, what you need to do is you need to click two-tailed significance here. Now once you click two-tailed significance, this will give you total indirect effect. This means that yes, there is mediation present. Yes, organizational commitment and collaborative culture are actually mediating the relationship between organizational learning and organizational performance. But the problem is we have two mediators. We need to assess each mediator individually. How do we do this? Let's move on. In this example, we only have one IV and one DV. Do we only see the indirect effect from OL, that is your first column, to OP in the third row here? So since we have got one IV and one DV, that's why we only have one single indirect effect, and this is the total indirect effect. If we had multiple IVs and multiple DVs, then we would have had multiple indirect effects. But in this case, this is the only IV and this is the only DV, and that's why we've got only one indirect effect. Now if we look at the intersection of OL and OP, the unstandardized indirect effect is 0.250. Now what is the unstandardized indirect effect? This is the total indirect effect from OL to OP through both the mediators. Now how do we get this? Again, you have to select matrices from estimates, then select indirect effects, and from bootstrap, estimates bootstrap, select estimates. Again, to calculate an indirect effect, it is very simple process. Now how do you calculate this indirect effect if you've got two mediators or maybe more? In order to do this, what you need to do is The indirect effect is actually the sum of A1 into B1, that is the path from the top mediator, that is collaborative culture, and this is the path of the indirect effect for organizational commitment. Now how do we get this? Now A1 is actually organizational learning to collaborative culture, which is organizational learning to collaborative culture 0.741. B1 is collaborative culture to organizational performance, this is 0.054. A2 is organizational learning to organizational commitment, this is 0.619. And finally, B2 is organizational commitment to organizational performance. Organizational commitment to organizational performance is 0.340. Now let's look at this. 0.040, 0.210. This is the effect A1 B1 and this is the effect A2 B2. Now this was done through regression weights. From estimates, you will get regression weight, individual effect or these direct relationships. But you can also have this calculated because you defined the user defined estimand. Because you defined A1 and B1, you created the user defined estimand that explained, okay, this is the indirect relationship of IV on DV through our top mediator, that is collaborative culture. This is the indirect effect from OL to OP through organizational commitment. Now what is the indirect effect? 0.040. What is the indirect effect from organizational learning to organizational performance through organizational commitment? 0.210. Now if we add this, we get the total indirect effect, which we saw was 0.250. Again, we can look at it. Look at this, 0.250. And this is the sum of both specific indirect effects, that is A1 B1, A2 B2. So in order to calculate it, you can use this regression weight table, which is in the estimates, showing all the possible relationship. Or otherwise, you can have it from user defined estimates that we already did. And user defined estimate is that these are the indirect effects of IV on DV through the particular mediator, which we get from scalars and user defined estimates. And here, select estimates from estimates and bootstrap. Now our interest is in identifying which mediator is significant. Is this path here significant or is this path here significant? Now these are the effects, these are the weights, regression weights. Now are these significant? Let's move on. So which indirect paths are significant? A1 B1 represents indirect effect of OL on OP through CC. A2 B2 actually represents indirect effect of OL on OP through CC. Now based on the results, we can conclude that the influence of organizational learning to organizational performance flows only through organizational commitment. Now look at this first effect, that is the mediating role of collaborative culture. Well, this is insignificant. Why? Because the p-value is greater than 0.05. However, the impact of organizational learning on organizational performance through organizational commitment is significant because the p-value is less than 0.05. How do you get this table? You have to go to estimates, scalars, user defined estimates. Select user defined estimates from this top tree structure and bias corrected percentile method from this bottom tree with the options estimates and bootstrap, and you will get this table. The mediating role of CC is insignificant. Why? Because this is greater than 0.05. If you have more relationship to test, you can label those parameters and make adjustments in the estimate function. Now you can add further mediators if you want and use the same procedure. By using the estimates function, you have the ability to isolate an indirect effect even when multiple mediators are present, just like we did here. Now, what type of mediation is there? Now, in order to identify the type of mediation, and now we know that, okay, the path from A1 B1 is insignificant, the path from A2 B2 is significant, which means that organizational commitment is a mediator. Is it full mediation or partial mediation? Now, in order to do this, we have to first identify whether the direct relationship, that is your C complement path, that is the path from OL to OP in presence of all the mediators, is it significant? So if we go to estimates and see our regression weights here, OL to OP, well, yes, it is significant. So both your direct effect and the indirect effects are significant. This means partial mediation. So we can see that organizational commitment partially mediates the relationship between OL and OP. Now, how do you calculate the T statistics? So what you need to do is, again, from estimates, click scalars and then user-defined estimates. You will get your path coefficients or estimate. And within user-defined estimates, you can click bootstrap standard errors. Here you get bootstrap standard errors. So once you click user-defined estimates, from the bottom tree, select bootstrap standard errors. And what you do is you divide the beta coefficient, that is this value here for path 1 and this value here for the second path, by the standard error to get the T statistics for this particular path and this particular path. Here it is. For A1, B1, it is less than 1.96. For A2, B2, it is greater than 1.96. How do we report mediation analysis? The first thing that we need to do is we need to write this text. So the steps are that first we need to show, okay, what are our mediating variables and what is the relationship that they are mediating. And then the results revealed an insignificant indirect effect of OL on OP through CC. Now each of the mediator is evaluated and we write whether the hypothesis was supported or not. Similarly, we did it for the next mediator, OC, that was found significant and its significance level was written. Now there's a typo, B is equal to. Now this is the T value that we calculated and this is the P value. Now H2 was supported. Furthermore, you can mention that the direct effect in the presence of the mediators was found significant and hence your OC partially mediated the relationship between OL and OP. Now here is the summary of the mediation analysis. So your relationship, your direct effect, your indirect effects, your confidence intervals, your p-values and your mediation. Whether there was a mediation or there was no mediation. So this is how you report your mediation analysis. Finally, if you want to know more, this is a very good book on AMOS analysis. I hope this lecture would have helped you understand how to do analysis in AMOS with multiple mediators. Thank you very much.